Chapter 8, The Nazis and the Acceleration of Caste. In the early stages of the Third Reich, before the world could imagine the horrors to come, a committee of Nazi bureaucrats met to weigh the options for imposing a rigid new hierarchy. On this day, June 5, 1934, they were there to debate the legal framework for an Aryan nation to turn ideology into law, and were now anxious to discuss the findings of their research into how other countries protected racial purity from the taint of the disfavored. They were impressed into how the United States managed its marginalized groups and guarded its ruling white citizenry. The 17 legal scholars and functionaries went back and forth over the American purity laws governing intermarriage and immigration. In debating how to institutionalize racism in the Third Reich, wrote the Yale legal historian James Q. Whitman, they began to ask how the Americans did it. They were looking to move quickly with their plans for racial separation and purity, and knew what the United States was centuries ahead of them with its anti-miscegenation statutes and race-based immigration bans. For us Germans, it is especially important to know and to see how one of the biggest states in the world with Nordic stock already has race legislation which is quite comparable to that of the Third Reich.
Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Reverend Ana Quintana, and this is Reverend Newsom Holmes. And this is part of our book study on the book Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. This is our third episode. I hope that you have had an opportunity to see the other two, which will give you an overall perspective of what we're doing, not only on the study itself, but maybe on a spiritual perspective of the whole thing. So please be welcome. And Newsom, thank you for starting with that chapter, because it was one of the chapters that really struck me big time. Almost to the point of shock.
Yeah. You want to say more about that?
Well, yes. Maybe I can get really personal from the beginning in today's dialogue. As I was sharing with you earlier this week, as you know, I am Puerto Rican American citizen. And I grew up in a home in the island. It was my father who had come from Spain during the Civil War years through Ellis Island, after being starved in the Civil War and seeing the wealth and the abundance in America. He really developed an admiration for this country that he instilled in all of us growing up. We even, for the 200th anniversary of the nation, we went to Washington, D.C. to celebrate the ideals of the American democracy. So I, in my upbringing and in my awareness, it's almost like America is the closest to a perfect system. I know, I am aware that nothing is really completely perfect, but based on how many other people around the world live and have to go through, and their lack of freedom and so on, created in me this sense of big admiration. And doing this book study has really been a wake-up call as to, really, was this really happening? Is this how, when we go deeper into understanding the system, this is what is holding all of this together? And I am dealing with that.
Yeah, I can imagine, because I think many of us are doing the same thing, going, oh my gosh, so, well, like for me, it's a little bit different because I grew up in the South and I knew things were very uneven and unfair. However, the compilation that Isabel Wilkerson does in her book is so extensive of the injustices and the one-sidedness and the particular discrimination laws and practices in the United States that I think I finally recognized that what I had kind of glossed over was much bigger, deeper, and insistent on especially African Americans' life. It was constantly in there, pushing against them and making life difficult. And that it was really about keeping one group status above another. That has was quite, even though I knew it was there, it's quite revelatory.
And then to be compared to Nazi Germany, which is like what any human being on this earth would feel shameful of, as you know, as a human being, to know that what some human beings put others through, and then to say that somehow studying this system inspired theirs, it's really big, Newsom.
It's really big. Let me read another few sentences here. Western Europeans had long been aware of Americans' paradox of proclaiming liberty for all men while holding subsets of its citizenry in total subjugation. The French writer Alexis de Tocqueville toured antebellum America in the 1830s and observed that only the surface of American society is covered with a layer of democratic paint. Germany well understood the U.S. fixation on race purity and eugenics, the pseudoscience of grading human beings by presumed group superiority.
It's definitely a paradox, Newsom. I mean, when you read the essence of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that talks about all men being created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain rights for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and then you compare that to this other reality, you go, okay, this is definitely a contradiction. But in spite of all of that, and this is what I'm hoping to accomplish through this study, the idea that we can dig deeper into the negative aspect of, or dark aspect of a country or a person, but we can still hold and see the other side of the coin, because there's always beauty, there's always something positive. And when, I mean, I still believe in what this country stands for, and I have to believe that this is just growing pains of a relatively young nation. Yeah.
I definitely think it's a growing pain. I think it's one of those growing pains that has been delayed. We have an arrested development around this. One of the things that I think has happened is that those words that were written at the writing of the Declaration and the Constitution turned out to be, while they were originally intended for just a few people, white men like me, they have expanded over the centuries, 2 centuries, to include more and more people. And in that, the trajectory is in the right direction, but the past is quite a bit darker than we thought it was.
Right. That's the main thing. We're waking up to a deeper reality. We knew about it, but as you study it and read this book, you realize, oh my God, this is so much more.
Yeah. So I was watching a PBS program, and in 1882, they had the Chinese Exclusion Act, where they excluded Chinese from being citizens also excluded them from immigrating. They could come here and work, but they couldn't immigrate. They could only work if they were merchants. It was all really about keeping racial purity, even from the Asia coming this way. It has been a so if you take the genocide of the Indians and the Exclusion Act of the Chinese and the slavery of African Americans, so basically anybody that wasn't Aryan, we could use that word almost, you know.
Okay.
Well, then they were excluded from the wealth and the generosity of freedom that we extended to ourselves, right? Therefore, you could see why the Nazis would come here and go, hey, look, these guys have been at it for a long time. You know, because we had.
Right. And then, as I'm hearing you, Newsom Holmes, would love to hear your take on how does that compare to our own process of evolution. In Unity, our first principle says, well, our second principle says that we are divine, that we are the Christ, that we are innately good. That's our essence. That's our higher truth. Still, we operate a lot from an ignorance of not acknowledging that divine nature. And essentially, the spiritual path is the path in which we are trying to accomplish that sense of true identity. So, how would you compare understanding and seeing that America has accomplished a lot for humanity, creating a democracy in which we are free to worship according to what we feel is our best spiritual path or religion, or freedom of press or speech? That's a big accomplishment in history, you know, not having to have somebody like a king or an external source of power to have complete authority over us, right? So my point is, just like we at the individual level understand that we might not quite live from that idea of wholeness and divinity because of dark areas in our lives, because of areas, immature aspects of our personality that still sees ourselves like something less than being an expression of God. Can we connect that to this idea that we might be looking at the dark side of our country? Still, we don't need to dwell there. We're here to look at it, heal it, and then get on with progress and advancement for all, and really honor what this country stands for. I know I took a long time, but I hope you understood what I'm trying to say.
Before we go into the individual part, I think what this book is basically saying, and it's what it's pointing out the most, is the institutional aspects of our discrimination, meaning that it's baked into society, and we as individuals are asleep, like you and I have just confessed,
Yeah.
to how big, how much it has been there, and how long it's been going on, and the fact that it's still here. Mm-hmm. And because of that somnambulance of thinking everything's a little bit or a lot better than it is, then we don't really know, we're not really awakening, becoming enlightened, until we do delve into this. And as a society, we will not advance until we actually make institutional changes, not just personal changes, but institutional changes that allow the world to be more fair, or at least America to be more fair to all its citizenry. And so, with that said, then our part, I think, as a divine being, is to act in such a way that we help bring about those changes. And
we do our part.
We do our part. We actually do something about this, not just say this is about my awakening, which is quite self-centered. And one of the great things about Unity as a movement is we have allowed people to make our development the center of our lives, right? But as the development of ourselves, the next phase is to actually partake in the transformation of society. Not just be about this little isolated I, but to recognize that there is only one presence and we are part of that presence, and as such, when we see something wrong, we should do something about it.
And I think through this book and through what the country is going through, we are seeing, how can we heal if we don't see? We need to see.
Right.
And then be able
see first.
See first.
See first. So we were talking earlier today about how to deal with internal problems, and the very first thing is to be able to sit with it and to sit with the discomfort that that problem has. And only by recognizing and then enduring the suffering or the sadness or the pain or the sense of loss that those experiences have, can you then be wise in your next step.
Right.
Otherwise, you're just acting en route.
And distracted and not not being willing to face the pain and to sit with the pain.
Yeah.
And I guess that I'm glad that we picked this book because it's really a wake-up call in which I have really seen in my own attitudes or perspectives, a tendency to stereotype, to box people according to what they have. Most people in that group have come to be, and it's like, yes, I'm sustaining through my own consciousness this system, and not anymore. I need to do my part, like you were saying. We all can do our part. There's this saying that I love. We're using it in the Spanish. It comes from somebody, I cannot tell you, it's not mine, but it's some quote that says, I cannot do all the good that the world needs me to, but the world needs me to do all the good that I can. And I think that by becoming aware to this level, each one of us can follow our intuition and inner guidance as to say, this I need to change.
Yeah, and we just had an election in which, to some degree, this was on the ballot, and it wasn't explicitly on the ballot, but to some degree it was, and the country is not sure which way it wants to go with that yet. So I think more awareness is in order for as a country to see more clearly the historical legacy that is still alive today. I want to say something about the Nazis. I was reading one of my other favorite books, which is called *Sapiens*, and that man was talking in there about the outcome. He also more or less recognized that Germany, by making such a terrible genocidal moves against the Jews and other people they did not consider Aryans or great breeders, and we as a country fought against them, and therefore we have chosen that this idea of that kind of racism is wrong. And so really many of these laws that they went for, we had an effect prior to World War II and have been somewhat dismantling it since World War II because the Nazis made it so terrible,
so visible,
and they were our enemies.
Yeah.
That we cannot be like them, at least in polite company. We cannot be like them.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And so I think we really it's very interesting, like the yin yang symbol. When something becomes so big, it's about to flip and become just the opposite. And so our very discriminating laws helped make it an even more glaring example of that, forced us to drop our discriminating laws. And So there's hope. I think there's real hope in that. You know, when we see it and we recognize it, we can change it.
And be willing to look at it and not walk away.
Right. Yeah. Especially people like me who have a life of privilege, you know, have always had an assurance that the law and society made it easy for me.
Still, don't take it too harsh. Don't be too harsh on yourself, because we're all doing the best we can, and it's fascinating to. I like that type of humility in you, Newsom, that someone says, "Well, I've been in a privileged position, so at some level it's easy for me. So many things have been easier for me, but there's still merit in your accomplishments." Just saying that.
Don't you like her? Yeah. So I do think it's a very subtle thing that's going on, and I think when we see such harsh rhetoric around these Black Lives Matter demonstrations and or signs or whatever, that essentially I think it's coming from people who for some reason don't know the whole story. This is my theory.
Right.
That they don't know the whole story, or they would at least be able to speak with compassion about it.
Exactly. The more we have been exposed to suffering ourselves, the more compassionate we become. And that's one of the gifts of moments like that, where it really opens us. Like Rumi, I love this quote from Rumi, like it is through those cracks that the light can shine through, Yeah.
Yeah.
As I'm hearing you about being hopeful, I was watching probably a couple of years ago, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered one of his inaugurational speeches. And this is just to talk about how nothing in life is really a straight path. There's going to be change, there's going to be ups and downs. But in that speech, I loved when he said that even if you look at a chart of the ups and downs of this country, there's been, when you draw a line, you're going to see a line that is going upward. Mm-hmm. So even in moments where we might see the opposite, we need to trust that sometimes things have to really hit bottom in order for us to see and then spring back up.
I think you're right. I think this is a country that works best under crisis. And
just like human beings, we do.
Yeah,
right?
mostly, yeah. And so rather than planning and developing ahead of the crisis, we wait until it becomes a big problem, and then we do something about it. And so I think we're in a crisis state. Personally, I think, I'm guessing that in part because of the pandemic crisis, mm-hmm. which has caused us to be slower, not moving around as fast, we have a chance to examine our own world more clearly. I've done a bunch of Buddhist meditation retreats, and in doing that, one of the things they expect is that if you will sit still for several days in a row, some of your stuff will come up. And it's usually
for you to see.
really quite painful to have that happen.
Yeah.
We were laughing about, my expectation of going to my first 30-day meditation
retreat. Be in a
retreat.
blissful state.
Well, yes, you come out and be so happy, What you are is scrubbed. You are not, it was not an easy job sitting there. It seems like nothing to do, but it turns out all that trouble and dysfunction begins to bubble up. And I think that's what's happening with our country. It's bubbling up. And one of the things we can do is try to distract ourselves or deny it. But if we don't, we could use it as spiritual practice. That in this moment, when it is very uncomfortable to hear these stories in this book, if we can be willing to experience the discomfort, then I think we would be more ready as we come out of it, or even as we're in it, to act responsibly around it.
something that I'm getting as I'm hearing you, Nusam, it's learning to breathe through it. I was taken back to a yoga class experience in which this yoga teacher several times, I think it's a lot that is used in the Hasana yoga, where you might be in a position that you're really uncomfortable. And what you're being asked is to let it be okay and just breathe through it.
Right. So in the same book, Sapiens, the guy describes what Buddhism was about, and Buddhism basically says all it asks is that you recognize things as they are, and you don't need them to be any different. You can just hang with it as it is. Of course, that leads to new behaviors,
Right.
but if you can do that, I think you become a better human being.
And when you do that from your higher perspective, from the Christ perspective, there's a much more powerful part of you that almost comes through to rescue you and to hold you as you are navigating turbulent waters. And finding that out, it's a gift.
It is. It really is. I think the whole, I think those who are willing to be courageous in exploring their own experience and or the experience of a country, they become better human beings because depth of compassion, depth of understanding, willingness to suffer without reacting. These are high spiritual states, something that we can all aspire to.
It's having peace in the midst of the storm.
Yeah.
And knowing that true peace comes from God, from your divine self, and that will always be our constant.
It's a good place to end. We'll meet again one more time to talk about this book. Hope you'll join us next time. And if you get a chance, please read this book. I think it will be well worth your time.
Thank you so much for sharing this time with both of us. Namaste.
Namaste.